Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello and welcome to the latest installment in the FIA Group's podcast, Empowering Plans. I'm Jon Jablon, and with me today is Brady Bizarro. Say hi, Brady.
Hello, Brady.
Hello, Brady. The classic Ron Peck hello. I would say
Still
keeping
going.
his legacy alive, but Ron's still alive and kicking, so he's got no legacy quite yet. But thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about a really interesting case with the potential to affect a lot of different areas of the self-funded industry. The case is Wesco Inc., the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan Mutual Insurance Company. That is definitely a mouthful. I think today we'll probably just call it this case or the case or even Wesco. In the future, who knows what we'll call it. But today, we're talking about this case specifically, so we'll keep it simple for you. What this case is about is essentially, at a high level, anti-competitive practices. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan is being alleged to have essentially transformed the market into an anti-competitive space because they have charged what is alleged as and I'll quote, a phantom tax on self-funded employers who choose stop-loss insurance from companies other than Blue Cross. It's a particularly interesting case because we've seen this time and again throughout our industry, right? I mean, there are various connections in the industry. Companies are connected to other companies via, all sorts of different contracts and relationships. And it's really not uncommon for TPAs to have preferred stop-loss carriers. Sometimes there are preferred rates and there are additional fees for choosing non-preferred vendors and all that kind of stuff. And in this case, the plaintiffs are alleging that essentially the amount charged was essentially a penalty, and that Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan is trying to stifle the marketplace and try to make sure that they are the only stop-loss carrier that their clients can reasonably use without paying, again, that what they call a phantom tax, which is a really interesting phrase. So the self-funded healthcare marketplace, it's not incredibly volatile, right? We've all been in this arena for a long time. We've seen its ups and downs. We've seen a lot change in many different ways, and yet here it is. The industry is still kicking. It is definitely in a different form than it was 10 years ago, and even 10 years ago it was in a much different form than it was 15 years ago. But every once in a while we get a case like this where if it ultimately gets decided, there's going to be some law made one way or the other. There's going to be some really interesting effects that have a ripple effect, right? It's not just about this one scenario. Whatever happens with this court case, it's going to set some precedent, and it's going to be really interesting to see what exactly that precedent does. So I'll back up a bit, and I'll go into some detail about that phantom tax. Essentially, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan billed it as an extra administrative fee. And what the plaintiffs allege is that it stifles competition by discouraging the use of alternative stop-loss providers other than Blue Cross Blue Shield. They allege that it inflates the costs for employers and employees alike, right? Obviously, if a plan is paying more, then often that fee trickles down to employees. And they allege that it violates antitrust laws like the Sherman Act. And what we expect Blue Cross to say is that there are nuances to antitrust laws. It's not black and white, right? There are lots of shades of gray. And there are arguments that are laid out that the fees are essentially standard costs rather than penalties. This is not assessed to penalize anybody, but it's assessed as sort of a necessary cost of administration because various factors, including, when Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan as the TPA coordinates and works with stop loss, well, it's easier to work with Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's easier to work with someone they know and have some sort of relationship with. Whereas if a group can use sort of any random carrier without additional fee, well, it might be a lot more work on the TPA, right? And any of you listening who are TPAs, no matter what you think of this practice, I'm confident that most of you are nodding and understanding what they're saying, right? And that using some sort of non-preferred carrier or a carrier with which the TPA is not familiar, it can get complicated. There are nuances, there are administrative snafus that can arise. And so that's sort of the crux of the case here. And the administrative complexities are what we expect to really be Blue Cross's expected defense here. So Brady, can you talk about some of the market effects and the practical considerations?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, I think just before I even get to that, I just want to kind of go back to what you're saying about in terms of the fee here and why this has actually triggered this class action lawsuit. John mentioned, did you say the amount of $4 PPM effectively, right? Up to $8 in some cases. And so for a group, again, the complaint gives the examples here, but if you've got 1,000 employees, you're paying $4,000 PPM every month. That's a lot of money. It adds up really quickly. And apparently Blue Cross has had this kind of fee in place for many years. But I think what's happened here is that they've just increased it to the point where, at least from the employer's perspective, they couldn't really stand it anymore and said, we think this borders now into the area of anti-competitive practices. And that's why I think this suit was filed. And of course, one of the things they're asking for from the federal court is that they issue an injunction and prevent Blue Cross from assessing this fee. And also they're asking for triple damages. So we'll be following for sure to see how it turns out. But in terms of the effect this could have, right, in the marketplace, I think there's a couple of ways to look at this, right? It's pretty clear that, Blue Cross is the largest insurer in Michigan. It's got some of the largest profits from any stop loss carrier in terms of premiums charged in Michigan as well. So they're kind of leading the market in that sense. Obviously, if they lose this case and they're not able to assess this fee, you could argue this would be better for smaller carriers, right? It would make it easier for them to compete in the marketplace and to get business from employers who are not being, sort of forced into using Blue Cross from their perspective. But to John's point, right? I mean, again, there are other reasons to think that employers might want to stay with, a large stop loss carrier like Blue Cross or sort of keep things sort of vertically aligned in terms of their ASO arrangement. Because again, as John mentioned, there are things like stop loss reporting, which are complicated to get done and have to be done very timely. And if you're going to use a different stop loss carrier than your ASO, then you're taking sort of a risk that this may not happen timely for you and you could miss out on a large claim. In fact, many of the administrative service agreements that we review will say that, if you don't use our carrier, we're not going to perform reporting for you. And now that's not the same as assessing a fine or a penalty, but it's certainly inconvenient, right? So the effect of this, again, I think it will sort of lead to smaller carriers being able to compete better, but the administrative complexities are still going to remain. I think you're still going to see a tendency to, have sort of alignment in terms of who you're choosing as your ASO and as your stop loss carrier. And I think, this is not going to discourage things like partnerships. Obviously, there are TPAs out there in the marketplace who have preferred carriers who they like to work with, and they may try and offer their self-funded groups incentives to use those carriers. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not going to stop, happening. I think it just comes down to this fee that, of course, Blue Cross says is that they're assessing it as a way to keep up their reserves to pay future claims. But, the evidence presenting in the complaint, sort of cuts against that or tries to cut against that argument. And it's just not possible really for smaller carriers to compete when you have a fee like that. So I think there will definitely be a shakeup in the market, however this comes out, right? If they lose the case, if the plaintiffs lose the case and this fee is allowed to continue, I wouldn't be surprised if, the fee actually goes up year after year, as just every fee tends to go up. It could also hurt the smaller carrier market and sort of lead to higher costs overall for self-funded plans. So that's sort of, I think, how the impact could play out here. And it could, again, lead to other ways that Blue Cross could find, others could find to try incentivizing the use of their stop loss carrier instead of others. For example, by charging like lower premiums, right? That's one way to do this. There are other ways to use incentives. So that's my take there, John.
Yeah, Brady, one thing that you said really sticks out to me, and this has always struck me as kind of interesting, but one of the defenses that Blue Cross put up is essentially that this isn't a penalty. It is just a way to fund their reserves to pay future claims. And for an insurance company, or particularly a stop loss insurer, the question that comes to my mind is, what is exactly the difference between funding a reserve and just charging a fee, right? I mean, if you're saying that you're going to use that to put it into a reserve to pay future claims, I guess I've never been quite clear on what the difference is, right? Because money is fungible. Whether you put it into one bucket or another, if ultimately one bucket needs to be filled up, whether it's filled up with this fee or with corporate assets down the line, probably doesn't make a big difference, right? So I'm not entirely sure how a court would look at that argument that, these funds are actually being used to fund a reserve. Because if I were a court, I might say, well, so what? You either fund them with this or something else. It's inconsequential what you do with the money. What matters really is the effect that it has in terms of competition and the like. And I think that that's what most of the tests focus on when deeming whether something is actually an anti-competitive practice. It's not just what you're doing. It's not whether you're doing it, right? You can write whatever you want in a contract, as we know from so many parts of the self-funded industry. Writing something alone doesn't change a whole lot in some cases, but it's really just the effect on the practice. The court's going to have to look at whether this practice actually has a tangibly and reasonably calculated anti-competitive effect. And that's where things get interesting. And that's where there's going to be just a ton of specific analysis that we can't get into here because we just don't know.
To your point about, when does it become an anti-competitive practice? Some people listening might wonder, well, why don't they just use a different ASO, use a different TPA? They don't have to use Blue Cross, right? And if they didn't use Blue Cross as their administrator, they wouldn't have to worry about this problem, right? You may ask that question reasonably, but when you dig into the details, right, what's happened is you sort of have these large companies and carriers dominating in every space in the industry, right? So it's hard to not use Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. They're a really good company. They were the largest insurer in the state of Michigan. And if you're a small employer or a mid-sized employer or even a large employer and you want to provide your employees with great network access to great providers, it's really hard not to use Blue Cross. So it's sort of like there's not a ton of competition, the plaintiffs would argue, in the TPA space itself, right, in the state of Michigan or in the network space for that matter. So they kind of feel forced into a box. So I just want to point that out in case people are wondering, you don't have to use Blue Cross. It's not so true anymore because over time, right, you've seen a lot of insurers sort of consolidate. There's been a ton of consolidation in the marketplace generally, and it's not so easy to do that. And one last thing is going through the complaint here. I'm looking at the details of the fee, and they actually get the dates where originally one of the plaintiffs here was charged $4 PPM. It was raised to $6 in 2018, was raised to $8 in 2020. So, in theory, this could keep going up $2 PPM every couple of years. And, you have to ask the question, at what point does it become anti-competitive? Is it okay at $2 as a fee? Is it not okay at $8? What about $16? I mean, so these are all things I think that'll get flushed out in the lawsuit that I think there has to be a number, right, where, it's clearly too burdensome to portray it as something other than a disincentive to use other carriers. And I think that's where a line will have to be drawn perhaps about what to use. But just wanted to get that point in there.
Yeah, that's interesting, Brady. And I think that your point about the dollars and the fee raises, I think that brings into question the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and particularly the compensation disclosure rules and all the transparency measures that went into place. And, I see one theory being that stop loss is typically not sold to a plan, but an employer. So, that argument could sort of weigh against factoring in the CAA at all, since the employer has no fiduciary, right? Only the plan has a fiduciary under ERISA. But on the same token, it's often the case that health plans themselves pay for premiums, even when the contract is literally signed by the employer. So I wonder how big an impact, if any, that argument could actually have. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some DOL scrutiny here, right? If the Department of Labor looks and says, this is almost exactly the type of thing that we were trying to avoid with the transparency laws, right? I mean, plans need to know what they're getting into. Unilateral fee raises are not looked upon terribly favorably in the market nowadays, right? Especially post CAA. And it doesn't give plans a great opportunity to know exactly what they're going to be charged based on their options chosen and things like that. So I anticipate that there will be more ripple effects than just this situation. I think that there's going to be involvement of states. And as we all know, states are at least a little bit bitter that they don't get to regulate self-funded ERISA plans. And so they go to stop loss and they regulate stop loss so they can sort of indirectly regulate ERISA plans. And, states do that by defining minimum group sizes and whatnot. And one of the sort of catch-22s I see here is that if a state were to regulate this, if a state were to see this lawsuit or, even without the court decision, right, there are some states that might see this and say, oh, we see this practice too. If they make a law that, say, prohibited this type of thing, right, and said that you're not allowed to charge an additional fee based on the stop loss carrier chosen by a given group, it might be promoting the free market, but it would also be sort of promoting stop loss. And I don't know if I see a lot of states who really want to do that, because the attitude we typically see from states is that they want to regulate stop loss as much as possible to avoid health plans getting sort of as much protection as possible, because they want self-funded health plans, of course, to still bear risk. They don't like that sort of what somebody has called sham self-funding approach. So by expanding the marketplace and making sure that plans can choose different stop-loss carriers, it's helping stop-loss and helping plans. And so it's just an interesting dichotomy from what we often see from state legislatures compared to what we might see based on this.
Yeah, last thing I'll add to this before we wrap up in terms of a regulatory and legislative impact this is likely to have. I think this case is an example of a broader trend where there's a lot more scrutiny, really bipartisan scrutiny on anti-competitive practices in the marketplace, especially in healthcare. You've seen in this most recent election with the Trump administration coming in, even his positions on healthcare and even those of his supporters have really been so targeting the perceived unfairness and the perceived anti-competitive behavior when it comes to PBMs, for example, right? Or again, in this case, stop-loss carriers. There's been discussion from the incoming vice president-elect, J.D. Vance, that he actually likes the current chair of the FTC, Lena Khan, who has taken on really the largest companies in the country, including Google, and a lot of antitrust actions. And so I think there's a good feeling, more than I've seen, in almost 9 years of being in the industry, really cracking down on anti-competitive practices. And it's something that, again, is going to cross the aisle. And when that happens, it's much more likely you're going to see action in this area, whether it's through the courts or it's through the legislature in Congress, maybe even at the state level, in terms of offering some relief here. Because ultimately, this is what's happening, is that you have employers being squeezed, right, from their perspective, premiums going up, stop-loss premiums going up, and prices in general going up, and there's no relief. And they look around the marketplace, and when they see a small handful of companies dominating and just squeezing them with fees, they get really upset. And that's, we need some kind of a relief valve. And I think they'll ultimately look to Congress to try and change this, to the new administration if necessary. And so, yeah, this is a bellwether case that we'll be watching, and it's definitely on my radar for sure.
Well, thanks, Brady. I guess that'll wrap it up for today. And if anybody has any questions on this case or implications, or of course anything else, please feel free to reach out. I'm Jon Jablon. That was Brady Bizarro. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll chat soon.
Thanks, everyone.